We're so excited to have Dr. Segurson here today. And as someone who has had the benefit of working with her and Maddie's Fund for a number of years, she is an absolute innovator and groundbreaker when it comes to dogs in shelters. And you can't really read an article on behavior without her being cited, dog behavior in shelters without her being cited somewhere. She's a total rock star and has done such important work for big dogs. And just on a personal note, I'll say that when I started talking about sending big dogs to fostering along with Kelly Dewar, she and Maddie's Fund came to our side and said, you can do it. At a time, a lot of people said that it was not a good idea, not safe, not feasible. And so that's just I'm one of the 1,000 people that Dr. Segurson has helped do hard things. So she's here today to talk about a subject she really hasn't gotten to talk about publicly very much, but one that is probably the future of how we do this work. So I'm so excited to welcome Dr. Segurson and turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Kristen. That's a super kind introduction. I really appreciate you, and I really appreciate being here. I'm going to be talking some today about trauma, stress, and dog behavior. As I said, I can't get around in the world without saying the word behavior. Talking about this topic that has been in my mind for a very long period of time as I learn and grow and figure out how to help dogs. And I don't have all the answers related to this. I have lots of ideas and thoughts. And my hope today is that I'm going to be sharing some of these ideas and thoughts with you so we can all learn and grow and think about this topic better and how we might better be able to serve the animals and the people who we have contact with. All right, hopefully everybody can see that title screen there. So trauma is a hot topic these days. And I know I see in posts on social media that people are getting tired of talking about trauma because everybody's talking about it all the time. But it's a hot topic because we've learned, or especially in the human world, learned so much about trauma and how it impacts who we are, our physical health, our mental health. And that by paying more attention to trauma and by having trauma-informed practices, we can better serve our communities. And there's some really good research that tells us about the impact of trauma on humans. And I'll be sharing a little bit of that today. But trauma is also relevant because of our worlds for the past 15 months, right? And being stuck indoors. And Mary talked about the importance of connection, and the lack of connection is something that helps, or I should say connection is something that helps to regulate us. The lack of having that as we've been more isolating is something that can dysregulate us and be, for some, even a traumatic experience. And so we've been living in this different world for so long now, starting to emerge from things. But this topic has been big on my mind, and I'm going to be sharing some of my thoughts about how what we talk about with trauma in people might be related to how we help our animals. I want to say first that that's a blurry picture of Fun Guy, a special dog that I worked with who had a trauma history. And this presentation is probably not going to be super actionable for you. That was not the plan. The plan is for this to be thought-provoking so we can really start thinking and talking about it and come up with action plans related to all of this. So I want to start by talking about some of that human research, and the biggest study that I've learned about is the Adverse Childhood Experiences study with over 17,000 enrolled. And I don't know if any of you have seen this work and learned about adverse childhood experiences. I'm sure some of you have, and I'm sure many of you have had personal adverse childhood experiences. But really groundbreaking work that looked at the impact of traumatic experiences. And for the purposes of this study, they defined being 18 or younger as the time range of adverse childhood experiences that they were looking at. And so they first wanted to find out how often children were having these experiences and then what impact it had on them later on in life. And they defined different types of adverse experiences. So abuse, physical, emotional, sexual, neglect, and then as well as having dysfunction in the household, which can be things like not having enough food to put on the table, mental illness, substance abuse. You can see some of the items up on the board here, but examples of adverse childhood experiences. And there is an adverse childhood experiences quiz. I don't know if any of you have taken that quiz. I've certainly taken it myself, but it allows you to look at your past and your history and how you your experiences are related to these ACEs, as people call them. When the research found that when children have adverse childhood experiences, as the number of those adverse experiences increase. So I might have a parent who uses substances. I might have a parent who neglects me. I might have a friend who physically abuses me. I have 3 ACEs. And there is a very clear relationship between the number of ACEs that a child has been exposed to and developing negative health outcomes. And so some of the negative health outcomes that can happen, you can see up here on the screen, very clear, lasting, long-term impacts on health and behavior of ourselves. And this picture looks at things in a slightly different way. So you can see these circles here show ACE scores. And these other colored circles show physical and mental health concerns as well as behavioral concerns. And you can see that with an ACE score of 0, so no known adverse childhood experiences, all these circles are pretty small. But there's a pretty direct correlation that as children have more adverse experiences, the risk, this green one is suicide, this yellow one is alcoholism, that there is a linear relationship in terms of our risk of having physical, mental health and behavioral challenges. And this is all in humans. We unfortunately don't have this type of data in animals. However, we're here to talk about animals. And so in relation to animals and trauma, there is research out there already that has been done in the past to support the concept that animals experience trauma and trauma has impact on their lives similarly to how it has impact on human lives. I'm going to share a little bit of that with you now. This slide talks about prenatal stress, neonatal stress, puppyhood stress. So stress even before an animal is born can impact their behavior forevermore. We know that's true in humans too. There's research that shows that the first month of a human's child life is one of the most critical period in terms of having healthy life later on. So early on is really, really important because that's when our brain is developing. And so when we look at the research in the animal literature, and that's why pictures like this one on the right, which was a shelter I visited where the puppies were not being cared for properly. And I know this picture is a little hard to look at, but we also know it's the reality in some situations where people are really struggling. That the good news about this picture is that the puppies were all provided better conditions and have all been adopted. So these puppies did have a happy ending. But talking about the research behind this, there's research done back in the 60s that found that puppies that were kept in a kennel environment beyond 14 weeks, so essentially being exposed to a traumatic environment. And actually, let me take a step back and make sure I'm clear about what I'm talking about related to trauma. When I say trauma, I'm talking about a response to an event that is deeply disturbing and distressing, and it exceeds our capacity to be able to cope with it. And so you can imagine how a young puppy living in conditions like this can be a trauma-inducing event for them. But back to the research. Puppies kept in kennels beyond 14 weeks, so kennels all the time. Those puppies later on in life as adults were timid. They had a lack of confidence in general and experienced neophobia. So anything new in their world and their environment, they had a phobic or a severely fearful response to. Other research done around the same time also found lots of other things, such as that puppies that were separated from their mothers and their nest site, so their environment, at 6 weeks versus 12. So some were separated at 6 weeks, some were separated at 12. And those 6-week pups that were separated showed appetite loss, weight loss, increased distress, increased death, and increased susceptibility to disease. So very strong impact of separation at an earlier phase versus a later phase in life. We also know that the neonatal and possibly the prenatal environment and experiences may influence reactions to stressful or frightening situations, because the environment and experiences have a direct effect on the development of, use big words here, of our pituitary adrenocortical responsiveness. So the development of our stress response system. Other research. So there's a decent amount of research out there on this topic. Probably one of the most important ones to mention is that study by Pirantoni in 2011 that found that adult dogs that were separated from their mother and their litter mate at 4 to 6 weeks versus at 8 weeks. So the difference of 2 to 4 weeks. And then they looked at those puppies later on in life as adults and their behavior. And they found that this earlier age separation was a significant predictor of excessive barking, fearfulness on walks, reactivity to noises, food possessiveness, toy possessiveness, attention-seeking behavior, and destructive behavior. So this study found a pretty clear relationship between early trauma and early separation and the presence of behavioral concerns later on in life. And I could talk about more research here, but I'm not going to stick on that. But there's a lot of work that's been done years and years ago looking at the impact of environmental changes that are traumatic on dog behavior. And that is why it is so critically important that when we have pregnant mothers and puppies, they do not belong in the shelter environments, because we are potentially causing a lot more harm than good by keeping them there. Other things that are related and can cause trauma in dogs, things like adverse experiences. And when I think about the shelter environment, and hopefully there aren't too many shelters that are using these overnight cages anymore, but this type of just being dropped off and put in a cage all by yourself, is that a traumatic experience for a dog? It's certainly stressful, and I would say that it is also a traumatic experience for them as well. And then neglect. This little dog on the left is a dog I fostered years ago, and her name was Tully. She was a starvation case, severely malnourished. And she also had, she behaved aggressively over her food, which I wasn't surprised about at all, given how neglected she had been and how much trauma she had experienced. So neglect, a big factor that can cause trauma. And then other things to think about related to trauma in dogs, things like abandonment and unpredictability. So just the concept of being put in the shelter environment or having an unpredictable environment where we don't know what's going on and don't know what's going to happen, that unpredictability itself can be traumatizing in a mild way to our canine companions. However, I want to talk really briefly about the 3 E's of trauma, and that is event, experience, and effect. So I'm going to talk about an event here. And in this example, it's went too fast, sorry. This example is a human example, but it might be a concert, a music concert that people go to with the idea that it's going to be fun and they really are really going to enjoy it. But not everybody's going to enjoy it. And so when we're exposed to trauma, the first E is the event. And for some people, that event is not traumatic at all. Like the people up on the top of the screen in the middle there, many people consider a concert like this a really, really fun thing and something they're going to enjoy and have a great time at, don't even consider trauma. But someone who has social anxiety, as depicted by the person in the bottom middle of the screen, that person might go to the event hoping they're going to have a good time, and then be completely overwhelmed by it when they get there. And that experience can be a traumatizing experience for them. So important to acknowledge that trauma, there's a relationship between the being, whether it's an animal or a person, and the traumatic event itself and how we experience it, and then the effects afterwards. In that, for some people, it's just a super positive effect. Other people, we might have long-term repercussions from that. And so part of it depends on our past history and the experience itself. Part of it depends on our ability to cope with stressors. So that person on the bottom could be someone who has a really good and strong support system in their life, and it's something they can recover from very, very quickly. But this event, experience, and the effects are all pieces of how trauma affects us and why trauma affects us all so differently. So thinking about the shelter environment now, and I want to talk a little bit about the concept of the shelter, as first acknowledging that we are doing the absolute best we can in the sheltering world in terms of taking care of the animals that are with us, and doing everything we can to make things good for them and move them on to a better part of their lives. But I want to talk here about the concept of the shelter as a place that causes trauma, in that just by the fact of putting them into the shelter, putting them in an environment where things are unpredictable, there are things there that dogs and cats aren't used to. There are things there that can be pretty extreme in terms of, we talked about social isolation a little bit earlier on, and can be pretty extreme and prolonged depending on how long you're staying in the shelter environment. So this is why I'm such a big advocate for foster care. When we talk about stress in the shelter, we talked about event, experience, effect. Not every animal is going to have certainly not every animal is going to have a horrible experience in the shelter, because we're all individuals. And it also depends on this part on the right here, which is our resilience and tolerance. And that if we've grown up, or if the dog has grown up in an environment where they're exposed to, so no stress at all is bad. In an ideal world, we're exposed to mild levels of stress that help us to learn how to cope with stress. So in an ideal world, before an animal comes to the shelter, they've been exposed to mild to moderate level of stress in their life. They've had predictable and controllable interactions, and they have their makeup is one of resilience, where they're able to cope with things. These animals are going to be able to likely going to be able to handle the shelter environment much better than animals who have a traumatic past, even before they come to the shelter environment. The last thing I wanted to mention about this slide is just the concept of sensitization, and that when animals and people are exposed to this unpredictable and significant stress, our systems get sensitized and in a place that is very unhealthy for us, that makes us very vulnerable. And that's what we'll be talking about next. So I'm going to talk about this slide only briefly because I know this slide can be overwhelming to people, but I want to introduce the concept of when our systems are overwhelmed. In an ideal world, when we're exposed to a stressor, we're able to think about things, we're able to rationalize things, we're able to figure things out to how best to respond to this situation. That involves using our cortex. And however, if we're looking and thinking about the neurosequential model, it is based on the idea that when we're exposed to a potential trigger or potential traumatic event, that experience needs to travel a path through our brain. So from the brainstem through other parts of the brain up to the cortex for us to be able to respond in that way. And if we're someone, or the dog is someone who has experienced significant trauma in their life, or that trauma, it's the first trauma ever, but it's very, very serious, we're not able to think about things. We're not able to get that signal up to our cortex because we're living in a fight or flight response type of environment where we're protecting ourselves, we're keeping ourselves safe. And exposure to trauma can prevent our brains from being used in the way that we would want them to be used. So we can get stuck in a place where we're, a lot of the time, anytime something triggering happens, we're stuck in this area of just reacting and responding in a fight or flight type of response. I do recommend, you see the link on the bottom, What Happened to You? Conversations on Trauma, Resilience, and Healing by Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey. It's a really good book. That's where this graphic came from that talks about all this in more detail. I'm going to jump by this one because of time and talk about impacts of trauma. We know that in humans, traumatic experiences can lead to things like emotional instability, hypervigilance, increased reactivity, and unpredictable behavior. The picture up there is the same dog who was on one of the earlier screens, which is Fungi. Fungi is a dog that I adopted actually almost exactly a year ago now. And he was, you can see his picture, cutest little dog in the world. And he had some very severe behavioral challenges and was biting people unpredictably. He was only 15 pounds, but he caused a lot of stress, trauma, and damage to people. And you can just see the look in his eyes, right? He was a really worried and stressed little dog. And I was able to, he had been in the shelter's care from the time he was a puppy. He was a ringworm puppy, and that's how he got the name Fungi. But it was Fungui, but fungi like fungus. And he was adopted to a woman who had a lot of trauma in her life at the time. She was an alcoholic She had him for 5 years. She does not remember much of those 5 years, but remembers that his life, she's a wonderful woman, and remembers that his life, and was very open about the fact that his life was not a good one. And he had lots of traumatic experiences in that time. And after 5 years of that, he was biting his mom. His mom is a recovering alcoholic. She hasn't had a drink in a long time now, but he had all this trauma, so had she, and they couldn't live together anymore. In that he was biting her. She described his bites as alligator rolls bites, where he would latch onto her and not let go and twist. That's how reactive this little dog was. And I'm going to show a quick video here. This is, I don't know if you can hear the audio, but I was all excited because Funny got his first BarkBox toy. Can you guys hear the audio there or no? No. So you can see I'll play it one more time as I talk through it. But first BarkBox toy, and then you see another dog comes near. I had no idea. I was just videoing what I thought was going to be a pleasant effect and a pleasant event. And he goes from 1 second looking at the dog, and the next second he is jumping all over that dog. And if you could hear the audio, you hear and luckily the other dog in my household wasn't hurt. But Funny was kind of the classic trauma response dog, in that he had dramatically increased reactivity. He was very hypervigilant, always on the lookout for bad things happening. He was emotionally unstable and unpredictable. So kind of classic trauma response in dogs. When we look at and talk about trauma, I want to show this slide. Can be a little bit confusing, but I think it's important. So I want to share it also from that same book. On the y-axis here is our state. So going from calm, alert, so states in terms of how escalating on the fight versus flight scale, in terms of how our bodies react to things. And here we have the things that we're exposed to. So things like just regular daily challenges versus moderate stressors in our environment and distress. So at this bottom edge here, we're very, very calm and just being exposed to a regular daily challenge, like we might be eating a meal. And on the top edge here, we're exposed to an extreme threat. Let's give 9/11 as an extreme threat, and we're experiencing terror. And then these three lines are what I want to talk about, in that in the middle is a neurotypical person. On the bottom here is a resilient person. So a person who has good and strong coping skills and lots of support and mechanisms in their environment to reduce their stress. And on the top here is a sensitized person. And so this is Fun Guy. So this is someone who has had lots of trauma in their life and doesn't know how to manage it appropriately. And you can see that this sensitized person is, even in response to daily challenges, they're moving up there on the scale and experiencing fear, and much more likely to be living in this place of alarm and fear and stress, as opposed to a resilient person where that's very uncommon. So how does this relate to how we manage our dogs in shelters? Going back to genes, environment, and behavior, which is oftentimes a part of some of these discussions. And I want to talk about broad causes of behavioral concerns. Usually we have the big categories of genes versus environment, and we say that The behavior that we see is often 75% based on our environment and 25% based on genes. So there's been talk out there about a long time that environment is the biggest factor in the behavior that we're displaying. And I'm not saying anything here that disagrees with that. I still feel that's true. When we look at environmental factors, some of the big broad ones to think about and talk about is just not having any training. So a dog may be jumping up on people and biting at them. That may be just because they've never been trained that that's not an appropriate thing to do. However, that same dog might be jumping up on people and biting at them because people have hit them or abused them or neglected them. So it might be their experiences and having had traumatic experiences or living in a stressful environment where they don't have control over the environment that results in the behavior that we're seeing. And I talk about this because when we're talking about trauma here, what am I leading to? Trauma is important because if trauma is what is causing the behavior that I'm seeing in the dog, I personally want to know that because that's something that I can potentially help to heal. I can't always heal it. Fungi was unfortunately a dog that I wasn't able to heal despite lots and lots of work with him. But I know that if there is a trauma history or I suspect a trauma history, I can potentially help that dog to recover from that trauma history. And I think it's valuable to think about that bad word behavior and behavior challenges, not as something that if you're displaying this behavior, you're a bad dog, but that if you're displaying this behavior, it might be because you've had something really bad happen to you in your past, which means there is hope that you can recover from that past. And that's why this topic is so important to me. So how do we know if there's trauma? I just want to mention briefly that this is going back to the ACEs study, but something like 22% of participants in that study had an ACEs score of 3 or higher, so 3 or more adverse childhood experiences. So about a fifth to a quarter of the people had a significant number of those ACEs. And our dogs, the same as people, we have no idea, right? But it's the frame of reference I have for the purposes of this discussion. I'm going to skip by this one and show this slide as we finish up here. So this slide, looking at genes and environment. So this is a 3D model courtesy of the amazing Dr. Karen Overall. If we look on the up direction here, this is a degree of a behavioral trait. And a dog who sits down here on this behavioral trait, so let's just say it's fear, has none of that behavioral trait at all. A dog that is up here has very high levels of this behavioral trait of fear. When we see this behavioral trait, it's a behavioral trait. We don't know what the underlying cause is of that behavioral trait. So this dog on the right is, you can see they're more on the side of genetics here in this 3D model. The dog on the left, I can't tell my right from left, and the dog on the right has a stronger environmental effect on their behavior. Physically, these dogs look exactly the same. We can't tell which is which, but they're both influenced by different underlying factors. And the important thing about that is that dog number B, who has this environmental effect, so it might be because of the shelter that they're displaying this behavioral trait of fear. It might be because of traumatic experiences that they're displaying this behavioral trait. But that dog, I can modify the environment or help them to recover from their trauma or work with them. And that dog then displays a more normal and appropriate degree of that behavior. So we can move that dog into displaying very low levels of fear. Whereas this dog with the genetic components, we can certainly help them because there's always going to be a combination of both, but we're going to be a lot less successful with dog A than with dog B. And so as we're working with these dogs, we're trying to help impact their relationships with the world around them and help them to, if they've experienced, number one, we want to determine whether trauma is a possibility. And the only way I know how to do that, we can look at history, but in many situations, we don't have history, right? And so what I want to do is treat them and work with them and support them to see whether they respond. And if they do respond really well, that makes me highly suspicious that trauma was some piece of this. And we want to work with them and help them to help build normal systems so that when they're exposed to a stressor, they're not stuck in this fight or flight situation, but they are able to stop and think about things and hopefully learn to respond in a more appropriate way. And I'm going to end with this slide. I could talk about this topic a lot more. I love it so much, but I want to hear from all of you. This slide that talks about, this is a slide for people, but talks about supporting people with trauma and the concept that when a person is dysregulated and not coping with stress and trauma in a healthy way, the first thing we need to do in that situation, and I would argue whether it's a person or an animal, is to help them to regulate, help their stress systems to calm down, because all the talking in the world, all the training and behavior modification in the world is not going to help the animal when they're in that state, because they're in reactivity state. They can't think, they can't respond. And so regulation and helping animals to have coping mechanisms and to remain calm is at the core, in my opinion, of helping our canine companions manage and recover from trauma. Once they can regulate themselves, then we work on relationships. And a lot of time we talk about in shelters, relationships are not where it's at, but relationships are where it's at. We go back to the beginning of talking about this, that this connectedness to people and to others is grounding, and it helps us to regulate ourselves. And so relating that to animals in a way that they are interested in, that they appreciate and like, and that isn't focused on the trauma. So you can see the example here. It talks about hug, playing a game, things like that. It's relating on a basic level and not focusing on whatever that trauma was. And then once we have relationships with animals where we can do this, we can help them to regulate and control themselves. We have relationships. That's when we can start working on teaching them. And we can't verbally reason with them, but we can start working and teaching them better ways to respond to things. So lots to think about here. I hope that this topic has been thought-provoking to all of you. That's all I'm going to share, and I'd love to hear what you all think about all this.
Well, so Sheila, we have about 3 minutes left. And so we're just going to have you come back next week and finish this conversation. Are you able to be back with us next Friday? Because I don't feel like we can end here. There's so many questions, and I'm getting all these private messages in the chat saying she needs to give this presentation here and here and here. Are you able to come back and kind of finish this out next week?
I would love to come back.
Sheila, I guess one other question I just want to touch on today briefly is, does this mean that we need to be doing better training for foster homes? So many of us are just pushing animals out as fast as we can into foster. Should we be slowing down to do more training with foster caregivers?
I think the answer to that is yes and no, and that one of the most important things is to get them out of the shelter. And I don't want to prevent animals from getting out of the shelter when we don't have trained fosters. However, when we do have animals that pose a significant risk, or we know have significant trauma, or we know have been in a shelter for a long time, yes, I feel it's really important that we have fosters who understand that, understand what these animals are going through, and know what to do to help them to recover.
There's so many great comments, so many thank yous to you, Sheila. Really appreciate this presentation. So round of applause for you. That was really, really heartening.